Cleopatra was born in the year 69 BC in the city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great and located in the Nile Delta. Cleopatra was an important queen of ancient Egypt, and her name crossed the ages, making her one of the most well-known women in the history of humanity. Throughout her life, she stood out as a strategic, determined, highly intelligent woman of great cunning, and the holder of an enormous fortune. The Greek philosopher Plutarch once wrote the following words about her. The contact of her presence, if you lived with her, was irresistible. The Egyptian ruler fascinated many people of her time, and to this day she continues to enchant many people. Her life's journey continues to be widely studied, researched, and debated. Much of what we know about this remarkable and striking Egyptian ruler has come to us through the works of historians such as Dio Cassius, Plutarch, Tacitus, and Suetonius, among other authors. To get an idea of her greatness, there are some interesting facts worth mentioning. In a temple dedicated to the goddess Venus, at the request of Roman leader Julius Caesar, who was Cleopatra's lover, a golden statue of the Egyptian queen was built. There is evidence that this monument was seen and venerated at the site until at least the 2nd century AD. A curious fact is that during her lifetime, Cleopatra was venerated as a true goddess. More precisely, as a new goddess Isis, one of the most important deities of ancient Egypt. She was also identified with Aphrodite, the Greek goddess whose attributes are similar to those of Isis. Cleopatra also possessed a refined intelligence as one of her main traits. She received an exquisite education, being educated alongside the other royal children in the palace where she lived. Cleopatra was able to communicate in some 7 or 8 languages, which undoubtedly facilitated her political agreements and stratagems. She is reported to have been the first person in her family to speak the Egyptian language without interpreters. She also excelled in her studies of philosophy and rhetoric. From a very young age, she had learned the art of oratory, which she could also use in the future, speaking with poise, appropriate gestures, and a soft voice. Her argumentation was extremely coherent and profound, and she always demonstrated great knowledge and logical reasoning. And that was not all. She also had great literary knowledge, being even passionate about the Iliad and the Odyssey, 2 classical works by Homer, from which, as it is told, Cleopatra knew and recited certain passages by heart. The Egyptian ruler also had notable knowledge of geometry and arithmetic. She was a special and fascinating woman. Regarding her vast knowledge, it is worth remembering that Cleopatra lived in Alexandria, which was a true cultural hub of antiquity and housed the famous Library of Alexandria, which possessed an enormous quantity of writings, something that had never been done before. These local circumstances were certainly very important and influential in the cultural formation of the Egyptian ruler. Her achievements led her to become the lover of 2 of the most famous Roman generals of her time, the famous Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Over time, as often happens with historical figures, much information about the life of this remarkable woman has been distorted. Today, we can find the image of Cleopatra printed on the most diverse objects, and her name is familiar to many people, although it is not always known who she really was. In fact, these physical representations of the Queen's figure tend to consist of one of the many distorted points in relation to her. Regarding the Queen's appearance, Plutarch once wrote, "So remarkable that there was no comparison, or one could not see her without being touched." We can also get an idea of what she looked like physically through a series of coins that were made and circulated during the time Cleopatra lived. These objects are the most reliable sources for us to imagine what she looked like. There are also some busts that have been carved over time and apparently represent the Queen. When we look at the coins, we notice that the nose and chin protruded a little, which in fact led the philosopher Pascal to write, "If Cleopatra's nose had been shorter, the whole face of the world would have been different." Well, Considering this humorous phrase and observing the features that represent the powerful Egyptian woman on coins, we can conclude that perhaps she was not as extraordinarily beautiful as cinema has shown us in its productions. But one thing is certain: her deeds and her character definitively surpass any Hollywood representation. And from now on, we will see why. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which remained in power for 3 long centuries, and whose rule was marked by many marriages and assassinations among family members themselves. This imposing dynasty began to take its first steps after the death of the powerful Alexander the Great, King of Macedonia, because with his death, the empire he had formed through his conquests was divided among his generals. Among these men was an ancestor of Cleopatra named Ptolemy the First Soter, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. After he began to rule the magnificent city of Alexandria, which was an admirable and unique cultural center of ancient Egypt, the dynasty took hold. Given this family tree, it is important to remember that the powerful Cleopatra we know and refer to in this video is Cleopatra the Seventh, as 6 other Cleopatras preceded her in her family lineage. In Alexandria, the queen lived in a very luxurious palace filled with riches and beautiful ornaments. The place was enormous and spacious, with more than 100 rooms, and an impressive outdoor landscape featuring dazzling gardens decorated with beautiful statues and fountains. This incredible palace had always been further expanded and enlarged as successive generations of the Ptolemies came to power. The place became the most luxurious palace in the entire Mediterranean. It was in this environment that Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy XII, grew up. She had 2 sisters named Berenice IV and Arsinoe IV, and 2 brothers named Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. When her mother Berenice IV established herself in power, her reign as ruler was short, and the young woman ended up being killed by her own father. Remember that the Ptolemaic lineage had as one of its main characteristics a succession of assassinations. In fact, Arsinoe IV was later exiled by Julius Caesar and subsequently executed by Mark Antony, all at the instigation of her own sister, Cleopatra. The fate of Ptolemy XIV was no different. Cleopatra began to rule Egypt at the age of 17, after the death of her father. It was then that, according to tradition, she married her brother Ptolemy XIII, who at that time was only 13 years old. Shortly after Cleopatra became Queen of Egypt, her brother and husband Ptolemy XIII began to show interest in governing the country alone, without his sister's intervention. Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus, 3 important advisors of the young king, agreed with this idea and were willing to persuade the boy to break with Cleopatra and remove her from power. On one occasion during her reign, the queen tried to maintain political ties with Italy and had already demonstrated her strategic skills. She began to strengthen her bonds of friendship with the Romans, who could become important allies in the event of a civil war in Egypt. Her main ally would be General Pompey, leader of one of Rome's most traditional families. Such diplomatic maneuvers led Cleopatra to be accused of treason for conspiring against her brother. During this period, at the age of 21, the young ruler had to leave Alexandria and went into exile in Syria, where she settled and formed an army. The young Egyptian king and his 3 advisors decided to go after the queen to prevent her return to Alexandria at any cost. But at a moment during their pursuit, they were met with the unexpected news that Pompey, who was rivals with the great Julius Caesar, was on his way to Egyptian lands. They thought he would be welcomed by the pharaoh, since he had been a great friend of his father. Pompey the Great was a very skilled general who throughout his life had conquered countless nations across Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was specifically after suffering a defeat in Greece that Pompey, greatly fearing, came to Egypt seeking refuge. After a disastrous defeat in Greece against his enemy Julius Caesar, a conflict divided the Roman Empire between Pompey and Julius Caesar. This conflict became known as the Caesarian Civil War. At that moment, when they learned that Pompey intended to land in the country, a confrontation arose that worried the Egyptian supporters. Helping old Pompey was a known risk, because it could sound like a kind of declaration of war against Julius Caesar, who commanded a very powerful war machine. In addition, Ptolemy and his allies were convinced that Pompey could somehow help Cleopatra retake her place in the royal family, and this was a problem to be avoided. But Pompey had been a great friend of the father of the ruling pair in Egypt, and therefore if they did not help him, he could sever ties with the country, which could make Egypt an enemy of Rome. All of them, Pothinus and the other two advisors, Achillas and Theodotus, deliberated on the matter. It was a very difficult decision to make, and the consequences could be risky. But finally, while the three advisors struggled to find a solution, Theodotus, with a smile on his lips, looked at his companions and said, "Dead men don't bite." Well, the choice was made. The idea was to get rid of Pompey and ally with Julius Caesar. As Pompey approached Alexandria, he felt that he would be received by the Egyptians. But in reality, they were conspiring against the Roman, waiting for him while only pretending to welcome him. It was enough for Pompey to set foot on Egyptian soil. He was soon assassinated in a brutal and bloody manner, his head cut off. Julius Caesar, a few days after the event, arrived in Alexandria to search for his opponent. The Egyptians showed him Pompey's head, and Caesar was shocked by such violence. Despite being his enemy, Caesar respected Pompey's figure. At Caesar's insistence, Ptolemy's advisor was executed. Caesar disembarked with his army and headed to the royal palace, where he settled and announced that he would like to see the king and the queen. Remember that Ptolemy XIII was preparing to confront his sister's army. When informed of Julius Caesar's arrival, he withdrew from where he was and headed to his palace. But what about Cleopatra, and how could she return? She had been banished from Alexandria, and if her brother and his loyal guardians wanted her out of the city, she was in danger, and she knew she could not be seen. The queen then had a rather unusual idea to meet Julius Caesar. She devised a plan, and to put it into practice, she counted on the help of a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, who was her accomplice. According to reports, they boarded a vessel in which the queen was hidden, sailing along the Nile River for a period of 8 days. When they were close to Alexandria, Apollodorus, still with the queen's help, placed her inside a papyrus transport bag. The queen's accomplice tied the large bag with a leather cord and carefully entered the palace, leaving the bag directly in Julius Caesar's chamber. We do not know exactly what the Roman's reaction was when he found Cleopatra, but we do know that the Egyptian woman soon convinced him. With Caesar by her side, everything would be easier. The opportunity to get rid of her brother and rule according to her own interests was finally within her reach. Due to the assassination of Pompey, Julius Caesar had a very poor impression of Ptolemy. Cleopatra managed to use the death of his former ally to her advantage. The queen convinced Caesar that she was the right person to sit on the throne of Egypt. The Queen of Egypt and Julius Caesar had a romantic relationship. Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra enraged Ptolemy, who declared war on Julius Caesar. The Roman general was at a numerical disadvantage and therefore took a defensive position. This event became known as the Siege of Alexandria. Caesar and his men fought valiantly to defend their position while awaiting the arrival of reinforcements. When his allies arrived, Caesar defeated Ptolemy's army at the Battle of the Nile. The young pharaoh ultimately drowned in the waters of the river. With Julius Caesar, the queen had a son named Ptolemy Caesar, who came to be historically and popularly known as Caesarion. Caesar's support was essential for Cleopatra to consolidate her hold on the throne of Egypt. The Roman general returned to Rome, and Cleopatra reigned sovereignly. Everything looked very promising, but a great change was about to come.